Welcome everyone once again to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. I'm your host Jonathan Robson, and today's episode will be a location spotlight episode based on the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. Today we'll be talking about the building's history, its infamous inmates, our past experiences, and the prison's claims of paranormal activity. The Ohio State Reformatory is truly a special and unique location for our team, and it should be fun to revisit the location before next month's Parapsychon 3 convention. Speaking of the convention, Parapsychon 3 will be happening on May 20th, 21st, and 22nd. The first night will be an exclusive meet and greet with various paranormal celebrities, and there will be a celebrity ghost hunt on Saturday night. I think you all know my personal feelings on those type of events, and our team will not be present for the ghost hunt itself. However, we will be present at the convention selling books and promoting the Paracast. The convention runs on Saturday the 21st from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and Sunday the 22nd from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. I know some of the events might be sold out by the time this episode airs, so make sure to visit parapsychon.com for additional information, for celebrities appearing, and to check the current status of tickets for their special events. For our folks that follow us on social media, it's also been announced that we'll be appearing at the West Virginia Penitentiary Paranormal Convention on August 13th, 2022. This will be the first time we've been to this location in over 10 years. The prison itself is truly an awesome building, and it's one of the more impressive structures that we've investigated over the years. Apparently we just can't seem to stay out of prison this year, but we're looking forward to our return to Moundsville. Visit the prison's website at wvpentours.com for more information. For our new listeners, please remember to follow us on social media, visit cbusparanormal.com, and subscribe to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast for the latest updates. We also have a Patreon page set up for additional content. We offer ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes looks into our investigations, exclusive content, and we'll give shout-outs to new subscribers on future episodes of the Paracast. We're looking to expand the Patreon page as we go, and we're looking to make it even more interactive in the near future. A small monthly donation goes a long way in helping us provide new content for the show. For more information, visit patreon.com/cbusparanormal Paracast. We're going to start off today's episode exploring the history of the Ohio State Reformatory. I think it's important to note that even the ground the Ohio State Reformatory was built on had its own interesting history. In August of 1861, the land would be used as a training center for Civil War soldiers at Camp Mordecai Bartley. It's believed that over 4,000 soldiers were trained for action on this site. The Ohio State Reformatory itself was designed by Cleveland architect Levi Schofield. Schofield designed the towering limestone building to be an uplifting, inspiring, and intimidating structure. I would certainly say he succeeded, at least on the latter. The Reformatory was originally called the Intermediate Penitentiary, as it accepted inmates that were too old for juvenile corrections, but had committed lesser offenses that sent others to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. The Reformatory would admit its first inmates on September 15, 1896, after the first 10 years of the building's construction. From the articles I've seen, the Ohio State Reformatory cost approximately $1.3 to $1.5 million to build. The building's famous cell blocks stand 5 and 6 stories high, and originally could hold nearly 2,000 inmates with one inmate per cell. However, overcrowding would eventually become a problem, and some cells would go on to hold 2 and 3 people in some cases throughout its history. Today, the East Cell Block remains the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world. The overall goal of the Ohio State Reformatory was to reform and rehabilitate its inmates. They would often be taught religion, education, and trades within the building's stone walls. The Reformatory would also establish its own inmate staff printing shop, as well as a manufacturing and sales division that would include shoes, clothing, and furniture. Inmates would often be admitted for 18 months. And if they showed progress, they could be released. However, if they didn't show improvement, they would receive another 18-month term. The model actually appeared to be successful, and the Reformatory would go on to have a high success rate. Unfortunately, by the 1960s, the state would pull its financial support from the reform model, and they converted the building into a high-security prison. This transition would obviously also bring about more violent prisoners. By the 1980s, the building's conditions had deteriorated to the point where the inmates actually sued the state of Ohio over inhumane conditions and intense overcrowding. And they won. Construction would soon begin on a modern facility nearby, and a reformatory would be closed in 1990. The building would sit empty for years until local activists rallied to purchase the building from the state for $1. They committed to repairing and restoring the structure for future generations. Unfortunately, parts of the prison's main complex were demolished after the building's original closure. That includes the outer buildings and the outer wall. Today, the Ohio State Reformatory is ran by a nonprofit organization volunteer board, the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society. The reformatory itself has become a hotspot for paranormal enthusiasts, and it holds special events with each passing year. Their website indicates that they typically welcome more than 120,000 visitors each year, and it's also become a favorite location for successful filmmakers. The building has been featured on Shawshank Redemption, Harry and Walter Go to New York, Tango and Cash, Air Force One, and Escape Plan: The Extractors. The building also holds a museum that features several artifacts from the reformatory and the Ohio State Penitentiary, formerly in Columbus. Throughout the blood-stained history of the prison, there have been at least 200 confirmed deaths on the property. Now, for those of you that know me personally, I probably just got your attention with the brief mention of the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. It's a location that I know very well and have spent a considerable amount of time researching over the years. Oddly enough, I also collect artifacts from there. A few of you asked me about the cell door that was in the background of a video I recorded last year. Well, it's from the old Ohio State Penitentiary, and it resides in my lair here at CBOS Paranormal Headquarters. We're going to take a few looks at the old pen during this episode as well, and it will likely come up several times when we do our episode on Prospect Place. We will get back to the old Ohio pen later in this episode. For our next segment, we're going to be talking about some of the prison's violent history and its ghost stories. Now, as an investigator, I try to find as much information as I can on each location. This involves fact-checking stories and information that I've been told, legends, and stories that are generally believed to be well known to the public. During this process, I will often find new information or lesser-known information that I can share with our clients and listeners. First off, I must give props to everyone that I've spoke to at the Ohio State Reformatory over the years. They've been top-notch on their record-keeping, and I was able to confirm several of their most well-known stories and tragedies through newspaper clippings and microfilm records. Some of the following information will be a retelling of past violent events, and I think it's important that we remember these affected individuals and their families with the greatest of respect. I will be sharing some old and new information from these tragic events that might help fill in some of the gaps in the stories that most folks are unaware of. So let us begin with our first story. One of the Ohio State Reformatory's most well-known stories revolve around one of its wardens and his wife, Helen and Arthur Galacki. Several newspaper articles from 1950 were able to confirm this story, and I'll be reading from some of the clippings that I have found. I've also found several photos of the victim in question, and I think it's important that we humanize each situation that we discuss today. I think we often get caught up in the stories and forget that these events actually happened, and that real people were affected by these tragic events. Please remember to be respectful while you investigate. The following is from the News Journal on November 7, 1950, titled "Shot Kills Miss Galacki." Miss Helen Galacki, 41, wife of Arthur Galacki, superintendent of the Mansfield Reformatory, died at 4:45 today at General Hospital of a gunshot wound suffered early Sunday at the superintendent's residence at the reformatory. Dr. P.A. Stute, attending physician, said Miss Galacki suffered a wound in the left upper lung. The husband of the victim said his wife was dressing about 10:15 a.m. Sunday and had reached into a high shelf to move the gun away from her jewelry box. Galacki said he believed his wife took hold of the gun which slipped from her hands, discharging as it fell to the floor. Galacki said the gun was a .32 caliber automatic pistol. The gun and the jewelry box were kept in a safe closet in her residence. Miss Galacki was reported alone at the time. Miss Galacki was the mother of 2 sons at the time of her death. This, of course, would cause unneeded speculation in the community, and people started talking and rumors started flying from the local busybodies. I could only imagine how hard and disrespectful this was for their children. Unfortunately, a few years later, on February 10, 1959, Arthur Galacki would have a heart attack in his office at around 4:30 p.m., and he would also pass an hour later at General Hospital. Back in those days, the superintendent and his family lived in the building, so it's not unreasonable for folks to jump to the conclusion that both individuals could be haunting the property. Obviously, this starts spinning the wheels of speculation for a haunting to occur. The circumstances, the location, it all matches up for the typical ghost story. Visitors and investigators over the years have claimed to have had encounters in the administration wing of the building. The most common report is the smell of roses, believed to be tied to Miss Galacki, near the apartment area, and a few individuals have also reported seeing full-bodied apparitions in the area as well. Violent events surrounding the reformatory didn't always happen within its walls. While the next story isn't a ghost story, it's also an important story that was tied to the building itself. Robert Daniels and John West, 2 former inmates later dubbed the Mad Dog Killers, would meet up in July of 1948 after they were paroled a year apart. They would steal a 2-tone Pontiac and rob a few gas stations at the beginning of what would become an infamous crime spree. On July 9, 1948, West and Daniels walked into Joe's Grill on West Broad Street, fired their guns a few times to clear out the crowd, and cleaned out the safe and the cash register. From there, they would stop at Earl Ambrose Tavern on 5th Avenue and enter through the back door, announcing that it was a robbery. Ambrose attempted to flee but was shot in the back 3 times and was killed instantly. A female patron was also shot in the abdomen but survived the incident. Fortunately, a bystander wrote down their license plate number for the police during their escape. The 2 would escape law enforcement and go out of state to avoid capture. It's been stated that they spent most of their time picking up girls, drinking, and doing small robberies to support their crime spree. Apparently, during their prison days, Daniels and West had long planned to return to the Mansfield Reformatory and kill several of the guards that they thought had mistreated them. Their first target would be a guard named Willis Harris, but when they arrived in Mansfield, they realized they didn't know where he lived. They then decided to try to get Harris's address from the guard's boss, John Nebel, who was the supervisor of the reformatory. On July 21st, in an act of revenge, the duo snuck back onto the property surrounding the prison and kidnapped OSR's farm superintendent, John Nebel, along with his wife and daughter. I'm not going to go into the grisly and disturbing details of what occurred at that point, but it's pretty clear that these 2 were sick bastards. The original plan was to tie the family up in a nearby cornfield to give them enough time to execute Harris. However, when they arrived, they realized they didn't have any rope to tie them up with. Daniels and West would take the family out into the cornfield and would execute them all. The Mansfield police received a tip about a 2-tone car that was seen in front of the Nebels' home and immediately knew it was West and Daniels. This would lead to what was dubbed the biggest manhunt since John Dillinger. Daniels and West would kill 2 other individuals in an effort to secure a new vehicle. The first attempt was botched on State Route 53 where they killed Jim Smith while his wife Rita escaped. I'm assuming they left the vehicle as there would have been a witness to what they were driving at the time. The duo would eventually murder Orville Taylor, a truck driver at the Old Fort rest stop, and take off with his car hauler truck loaded with Studebakers. The duo's Pontiac would later be found by the authorities along with Taylor's body. Daniels and Riggs would eventually be involved in a shootout with police at a roadblock. West would be shot and killed during the incident while Daniels, hiding in the top of the rig, was apprehended. The Mansfield newspaper had offered a $250 reward for information leading to the killers, and they would end up giving it to Rita Smith. She would go on to give the reward to Orville Taylor's family as his murder left behind a wife and 4 children. Daniels would proudly boast about his murder spree to the media, and then later changed his story during the trial, claiming that West had killed all of the victims. Daniels would eventually be convicted and executed in the Ohio State Penitentiary's electric chair in 1949. Daniels' body was escorted out the back door and buried in an undisclosed location to prevent vandalism and desecration. We're going to be circling back to that infamous electric chair later in this episode. Another story and legend based around a reformatory is of local resident Phoebe Wise. Now, anybody that knows me knows that I love disproving legends and nonsensical stories. I was able to find several variations of Phoebe's story, which means that obviously somebody either didn't properly research it, or that legend has seemingly taken over in some cases. Phoebe lived directly across from the Ohio State Reformatory in a wood farmhouse. She would often be outside talking to her animals, which included a horse, dog, and stray cats, which made some of the gossiping townfolk think that she was insane. She inherited the farm from her father, who was a successful surveyor in Mansfield, and the house fell into disrepair shortly after his death. Apparently, the locals thought that she was rich as she didn't trust banks, and they believed that she had to have a fortune stuffed in the walls of her home. Part of this was due to her father selling part of the family's land for the construction of the reformatory, and the locals were convinced that she had to be hiding money. On Christmas Eve 1891, 3 men broke into her home and basically tortured her trying to get information on the whereabouts of her missing money. They would walk away with a diamond ring, a gold watch, and a little cash, but nothing of substantial value. The men were later arrested, but they didn't spend any time in jail for the incident. I originally stumbled across Phoebe's story through the Weird Ohio website that claims that she was murdered during this incident. That supposedly led to her ghost stalking Reformatory Road in front of the prison to this day. Perhaps somebody should tell them that she lived another 41 years and died of old age in 1933. Weird, eh? Unfortunately, the crime would bring unwanted fame to Phoebe, and a mentally ill stranger named Jacob Kastanowitz started stalking her. Phoebe's stalker would stop by several nights trying to look through the windows, knocking on doors, etc., until he eventually assaulted her. The police would arrest him, but he was transferred to an insane asylum and later released. Jacob would return to Phoebe's house in May of 1898 and supposedly yelled through an open window, "Marry me or kill me, Phoebe Wise." Phoebe chose the latter and shot the man through her window, or door depending on what newspaper article you read. Jacob would die from the incident. The following morning, Phoebe would take the trolley car to town and report the incident to the police. The mayor of Mansfield and a prosecuting attorney agreed that the incident was in self-defense and she walked. In 1918, Phoebe nearly froze to death in her home and made a public statement to the local newspaper. "Now don't you put it in the paper that I'm dead. I'm feeling fine and they have all sorts of stories going on about me." As I previously mentioned, Phoebe would die of old age in 1933. The farmhouse was left abandoned, and the locals who believe in the treasure stories tore apart the walls and the floors, but nothing was found. The house is now a distant memory, but I'll post a photo of it on social media in a few days for reference sake. Some locals to this day still claim to see Phoebe walking along Reformatory Road at night. Are the ghostly stories true? I'm not sure, but Phoebe surely lived an interesting life. Most prisons have a long and winding history of prisoner violence. The Ohio State Reformatory is no different. That leads us to inmate James Lockhart. Man, this one's always a bit tough to talk about. I've had my own personal paranormal experiences in a cell, and it's often a frequent stop amongst the building's tourists. The following is from February 6, 1960 edition of the News Journal newspaper. The article is titled, "Inmate Burns Self to Death at the Ohio State Reformatory." James Lockhart, 22-year-old inmate at Mansfield Reformatory, took his own life in his cell last Saturday by setting fire to the furnishings and his own clothing. Ohio State Reformatory officials disclosed today that the incident took place while other inmates were at supper. Superintendent George Aldering said the prisoner had told the guards he did not want to go to the mess hall, and that was not considered unusual since prisoners are permitted to buy food at the commission area on Saturdays. Aldering said that Lockhart sprinkled lighter fluid on his clothing and the mattress in his cell. 2 guards, Paul Sheik and John Fraudelter, were burned on the face and hands when they attempted to go into the cell to secure Lockhart. Aldering said Lockhart, however, ran to the far corner of his cell and refused to come out. Flames from the mattress forced the guards back. Lockhart was received from Scioto County on October 5, 1955 to serve 1 to 15 years for assault with the intent to kill. Aldering said the inmate spent a little more than a year at Lima State Hospital in 1955 and 1956, but since his return has showed no signs of suicidal tendencies. Dr. D.C. Lavender, Richland County coroner, ruled the death due to asphyxiation, although the man's body was also burned. So yeah, Lockhart certainly existed and the story is true. From a humanization standpoint, I think it's important to note that Lockhart had signs of suicidal tendencies about 5 years before this incident. He was clearly a danger to himself and others. I can only imagine the amount of pain and trauma someone would have to be going through to be willing to do this to themselves, let alone at the young age of 22. Lockhart's family never claimed him after he died, and he's currently buried in a cemetery at the back of the property, currently off limits to visitors. From a paranormal standpoint, teams and individuals have seemed to be able to get EVP responses from his cell over the years. Some websites have tried to claim other liquids were used to start the fire. However, as this article confirmed, it does appear to have been lighter fluid. A few years back, I asked him what he used to start the fire, and our team did receive a response of lighter fluid within his cell. Our final tragedy involves a guard named Frank Hanger who was murdered in a botched escape attempt at the age of 42. The following information comes from a Tribute article from the Knox Pages on August 11, 2019. Frank Hanger had lived in Mount Vernon with his second wife at the time of his death. The couple would go on to have 2 children. Frank was hired as a guard at the Ohio State Reformatory in 1930. Jobs were hard to come by at that point in history as the country was suffering during the Great Depression. Unfortunately, Frank had no idea that his new job would be the cause of his death. In September of 1932, a woman named Ella Thompson, a former beauty shop operator from Cincinnati, showed up at the reformatory to visit her son and inmate Charles Williams. The only problem is Charles Williams wasn't her son, according to the Hamilton Evening Journal on November 21, 1932. Apparently, their relationship was rather complicated. I'm honestly still not sure what the real relationship was after reading several newspaper articles on the matter. Ella was attempting to sneak in contraband to Charles by concealing saw blades within the pages of magazines she brought in for him. She would be arrested shortly after, and they discovered 2 guns on her person at the time of her arrest. Williams was questioned about it, but he pled his ignorance on the matter. The assistant warden wasn't impressed by this denial, and they sent him to the back half of solitary confinement. Williams quickly started talking up his ideas of escape with prisoners in the cells around him. He would eventually enlist the support of 3 fellow inmates, Merrill Chandler, Chester Probosky, and James Allen. During their discussions, Merrill Chandler advised Williams that he had been working on the latch locking his cell door, and he felt that it could be opened if he had a way to pry it open. Williams was able to tear out a loose metal support plank under his bed and slide it over to Chandler's cell. Chandler was then able to pry the latch open. After breaking out, Chandler was able to find 2 long 10-pound pieces of iron, and he started pacing in his cell until midnight. He would then hear the keys rattling as Frank Hanger was beginning to make his rounds. Frank would open the door into the correctional tier, and he stepped over to flip on a light switch when Chandler blindsided him and hit him in the head with a piece of iron. Unfortunately, the hit would crack Frank's skull and he was unable to defend himself. Chandler would hit him again after the first blow and leave Frank lying on the ground. Chandler quickly grabbed Frank's keys and started releasing his fellow inmates. Probosky would come out of his cell and collect Frank's gun. James Allen would join him and also search Frank's pockets. A nearby trustee prisoner, Ralph Cathorn, sensed something was wrong as he heard Frank shouting during the attack. He would run to the nearest door and hit the emergency call button, which rang up to the central guard room. The guards would quickly hit the area and apprehend all 4 of the ringleaders of the botched escape attempt. During the scuffle, O.S. Garver, the assistant superintendent, accidentally shot and wounded himself in the leg during the commotion. Not sure how that exactly happened. But yeah, the newspapers reported it happened at the time. Sadly, Frank Hanger would unfortunately pass on October 6, 1932, at the prison's hospital. Indictments came down swiftly. Chandler confessed and recanted. The 3 would all go on to plead not guilty to the charges of murder in the first degree. Williams would eventually agree to plead guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter for his part as the mastermind of the plot. He was sentenced to 5 to 20 years in the state penitentiary. However, his mental health later deteriorated and he was transferred to the Lama State Hospital. Initially, Chandler, Probowski, and Allen all received the death sentence, but Allen was granted a retrial and found not guilty of aiding and abetting the murder. Chandler and Probowski, however, were executed at the Ohio State Penitentiary on November 24, 1933. Ironically, they were executed on the electric chair, which now sits in the museum of the Ohio State Reformatory. Talk about coming full circle, huh? Another similar event had transpired a few years earlier in November of 1926 when Urban Wilford, who was 72 years old at the time, unfortunately became the first officer killed in the line of duty at the reformatory. Parolee Philip Orlick returned to the reformatory and shot Wilford to death while trying to help another prisoner escape. For reference, Wilford was gunned down near the west gate of the prison yard. Orlick was eventually captured in Chicago after a series of robberies and convicted. He was also executed on the same electric chair at the Ohio State Penitentiary. There have been some reports of paranormal activity possibly related to Frank Hanger, and also the Ohio State Penitentiary's electric chair over the years. Oddly enough, Frank's story might be one of the reasons why I got into the paranormal. We'll go over the beginnings of the C-Bus Paranormal team in our next segment, and I think you'll also see the possible connection. Hey, you. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? I can tell you firsthand that starting a podcast has been a fun and rewarding experience. However, the process can feel overwhelming if you don't know how to get started. That is where Buzzsprout comes in. In fact, it's so good that they've already helped over 100,000 people start their own podcast. Buzzsprout will help you get your podcast onto every major podcasting platform, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You also get a professional website and audio players to share on other websites, detailed analytics, and other tools to help you promote your episodes. Buzzsprout also publishes tutorials, blog posts, and YouTube videos every week to help you get started. To launch your own podcast and to collect your $20 Amazon gift card for signing up, click the link in our show notes on this media player's information panel. This will help support our show, and it will also help Buzzsprout know that we sent you. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. This episode was also brought to you by our good friend Spencer Shepard at B&B Concrete in Shelby, Ohio. He has some amazing stone pieces for your lawn and garden, such as Sasquatches, gargoyles, bird bass, and even dragons. Be the coolest person on your block and visit facebook.com/bnbconcreteman or email bnbconcreteman@gmail.com for more information. Well, I told you we would eventually be getting back to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. I remember watching the building being torn down as a child, and I remember thinking of how impressive a massive structure it was. I could still see into the decaying cell blocks from the road, and my mind would start thinking about all the crazy events that took place within the building. Even then, as a child, it seemed like such a waste of history to tear the prison down. Little did I know that I would eventually spend an extensive amount of time researching the prison's records a few decades later as one of the owners of Prospect Place Mansion. That would eventually lead to me owning a piece of the prison's outer stone wall, a lot of its 1800s history books, and even acquiring a prison cell door from the location a few years later. Yeah, I guess you can say I have a weird fascination for the old Ohio State Penitentiary. We briefly touched on this on episode 1, but the C-Bus Paranormal team's first investigation was actually before we even formed the team. I had just retired from playing in my death metal band at the time, and started doing music production work with my buddy Ryan Bumgardner. Ironically, Ryan was also an EMT volunteer for the Ohio State Reformatory at the time, and we thought it would be awesome to film some segments inside the old prison for our webcast. We had secured exclusive access to film some segments, and we decided, what the hell, let's try to investigate and see if we get something. We both had an interest in the paranormal, but I had never investigated up to that point. Ryan and I would eventually make our way to the dark side of solitary after a fairly slow night, and we'd sit in one of the back cells asking questions. At the time, I remember hearing a faint breath-like sound, and I stated it to Ryan, who was sitting across from me. We'd eventually get up and start walking outside of solitary, and we both felt like something was following us. This occurred all the way up to the top level of the west cell block. We both stopped twice from hearing what we thought was a voice around us, but we weren't sure at the time. Ironically, once I started listening back to the audio, we were able to pull various audio clips from the 40-minute period of something following us. The common message seemed to be, "Hey, help. Help me." And it started following us right after I thought I heard something in solitary. Could this have been Frank's spirit, looking for assistance? Or possibly a past prisoner in distress? Honestly, I don't know. But it certainly got my attention, and I decided to form a team shortly after that night in 2011. I hate to quote Ghost Adventures. Well, for anything. But shortly after my experience, I did stumble into their episode of the Ohio State Reformatory, and I found something interesting during their investigation. They were in solitary when their audio feed suddenly cut out. One of the investigators looked at the camera and stated that something said "hey" in his ear. Naturally, they didn't have recorders going on at the time, but if they did, I wonder if the voice and tone would have matched my experience. I've also heard this voice pop up on other teams' EVP evidence in the past, so I do find it interesting in that regard. I remember talking to Scott Sukol from the Ohio State Reformatory shortly after they acquired the electric chair from the Ohio State Penitentiary. I told him about my experiences. Scott actually lived in the building for quite some time, and he had extensive research and knowledge of the building and its EVPs. He documented everything back then. We started talking about Frank Hanger, and he stopped for a second, and he told me a recent story of a team had played him an EVP. The investigator asked about Frank Hanger and received an EVP response of, "I hit him on the head." Scott then realized that the electric chair that they had just inherited for the museum also executed 2 of the individuals involved with Frank Hanger's murder. Could the original murderers have been brought back to the building with the electric chair from the Ohio State Penitentiary? If you believe in spirit attachments to objects, that's one hell of a connection, and it's certainly something to think about. We've investigated a building several times over the years, and even as a skeptic, I think there's possibly something going on in a reformatory. I find it ironic that most of the prison is made out of limestone, which some paranormal investigators believe can hold energy, aka the stone tape theory, which we discussed in episode 1. I don't think it would be unreasonably far-fetched to think that if hauntings do exist, that the reformatory would be a paranormal hotspot. And it seems that it might be after all. I strongly recommend the Ohio State Reformatory for investigators that want to have their own experience. Alright, it's that time again, to answer a question from one of our listeners online. This question was submitted by Sean through the contact form of cbusparanormal.com, and it asks, have you ever experienced a physical attack during an investigation? Well, this seems like a good episode to address that question. In nearly 11 years of being involved with the paranormal, I've only had one possible physical experience, and even then, I wasn't sure what to think of it. Oddly enough, it did happen at the Ohio State Reformatory during our Mayan End of the World investigation in 2012. Before I go into the story, I do want to state that the Ohio State Reformatory has had a history of supposed physical attacks. Scratches, marks, hair pulling, you name it. So I'm not the first, and certainly not the last, to experience something weird in a prison. Now, I normally don't try to instigate an entity, but there are times of low activity that I might say or do something to get a rise out of a supposed haunt. The investigation in question, I admittedly got a bit fired up. I was trying my best to get something to happen on the east cell block. As we have thunder in the background now. At the time, there were 3 of us walking down the cell block, and I was in the middle of 2 other investigators. At that time, I had a real-time audio recorder in one of my hands and a thermal imager in the other, when I suddenly started feeling a burning sensation on my left eye. I immediately informed the other 2 investigators to have a look and see if they seen anything. They both stated that my eye looked a little swollen and that we should monitor it. During the minutes that followed, it would appear to darken, and essentially I had what appeared to be a black eye. So yeah, in short, I left with a black eye that I didn't have at the start of the investigation. It honestly didn't seem to be related to any sort of medical condition or anything that I could immediately throw out. I personally don't consider physical attacks as evidence necessarily, but I do document the occasional happening in our investigation logs. That was certainly one of those odd moments where I wasn't really sure of what to think at the time, or even now. It's the only physical incident that I've ever possibly had. Thank you for your question, Sean. I've also been going through our inbox and realized I missed a few messages from our main website, so my apologies. We've added to our social media presence this year, and I'm admittedly still getting used to some of the changes. Other than a Nigerian prince trying to offer me millions of dollars every couple of emails, a few legit messages did come in between all the spam. This next message is from Caleb Bartell, who is from Go Static in Cleveland. I dig the name, by the way. And he asked if we'd be interested in collaborating at some point. Mike and I would like to start collaborating from time to time with different groups. Unfortunately, right now we're still waiting for his medical condition to improve before we get back at it. So I've had to make some changes with our programming and our investigation schedule as well, in the meantime. So never say never, but I'm not sure when the investigations will start up again. Once things settle down a bit, we'll start going over our options and our possibilities. From my standpoint, I'd certainly welcome the possibility of teaming up in the future. I do appreciate your interest, Caleb, and hopefully that option will be available at some point. Once again, you can submit your questions to us on social media or through the contact form on cbusparanormal.com. I've been trying to make posts from time to time on social media to let everybody know what's coming in the episodes ahead. We do appreciate the responses and the participation that we've received. Thank you once again, everybody. Well, that's the end of our first location spotlight episode. I hope that everybody enjoyed listening to me talk about the Ohio State Reformatory and our team's experiences from our past investigations there. Hopefully some of you will come out and see us next month at the Parapsychon 3. Again, visit parapsychon.com for details. I will be posting some articles and some newspaper clippings during the next month on our social media feeds to go along with what we've discussed today. So stay tuned to our social media pages for more information on that. Are you interested in visiting the Ohio State Reformatory? Visit their website at mrps.org. From there, you can book paranormal events, learn about the movies that have been filmed there, buy tickets, and also see what events they have coming up later in the year. Next month, we will be discussing historic Prospect Place Mansion, a location that you guys have wanted me to dive into ever since we started the Paracast. As most of you know, I was one of the owners of the property from 2017 to 2022, and I've also did some rather extensive research to disprove some of the legends and misinformation that was aired on television about it. Do you think you know the history of Prospect Place? Well, think again. It's time to call out some of the paranormal television shows for what they truly are. Once again, please remember to subscribe to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast on your favorite podcasting platforms, and I'll see you next month. Until then, get busy living or get busy dying. Thanks, guys. Would you like to meet our team in person? Join us at the Parapsychon 3 on May 21st and May 22nd, 2022 at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. We'll be there on Saturday, May 21st from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and Sunday, May 22nd from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Make sure to visit Parapsychon.com for more information on the celebrities that'll be appearing and special events that they'll be having at the convention. We will also be appearing at the West Virginia Penitentiary Paracon in Moundsville, West Virginia. The event will be taking place on Saturday, August 13th, 2022. Information on this event is still to come, so visit wvpentours.com for more information.